It happened overnight, a shift in the air so sudden and so violent that it sounded like an invisible army marching across the continent. On the evening of January 5th, 1709, Europe went to sleep in a mild winter, but it woke up in an ice age. In France, the temperature plummeted so drastically within a few hours that the moisture in the massive oak trees expanded and burst, creating a sound like gunshots ringing out through the forests, thousands of trees exploding from the inside out, shattering the silence of the night. People huddled in their beds, listening to the woods dying around them, terrified that the world itself was cracking apart. It was a cold beyond understanding, a cold that would change history. Welcome to the Dreamscape of History. Tonight, we are stepping away from the warmth of the hearth and walking out into the white, silent void of the past. We are exploring the winters that tried to extinguish humanity, the holidays where the snow didn't bring joy, but survival. So, dim the lights, curl up under your blanket, and let the frost set in. The Great Frost of 1709 remains the coldest winter Europe has endured in the last 500 years. It was not merely a weather event, it was a cataclysm. As the sun rose on January 6th, the feast of the Epiphany, the end of the Christmas season, the light revealed a landscape that had become alien. The rivers were not just frozen, they were solid stone. The soil was hard as iron, and the air was so sharp it felt like inhaling broken glass.
The cold was insidious. It ignored walls and it ignored wealth. It crept through the stone gaps of peasant cottages and the velvet curtains of palaces alike. In the countryside, the silence was absolute. Usually, winter is filled with the sounds of livestock or birds, but the birds were falling from the sky. Travellers found sparrows and crows frozen in mid-flight, their bodies hitting the hard earth like stones. In the barns, cattle died standing up, their breath freezing in their lungs before they could exhale. The rivers, the arteries of trade and life, stopped moving. The Rhone, the Po, and the Danube, all sealed shut. But the true horror, the thing that defied all reason, was the sea. Along the coasts of France and Italy, the saltwater ocean began to freeze. It started at the shore, a creeping white crust moving outward mile after mile, until ships were trapped in the harbour, crushed by the expanding ice like toys. Sailors walked across the Mediterranean, a sea that was supposed to be warm, venturing miles out onto a surface that should have been liquid. It was a surreal nightmare, a world where the fundamental laws of nature seemed to have broken. In the wine cellars of the finest vintages of Champagne and Bordeaux, the pride of the nation began to freeze. The alcohol content could not save them, bottles shattered by the thousands, exploding in the dark cellars. The wine that didn't shatter turned into blocks of red ice. Desperate, starving people later would chop the frozen wine with hatchets, selling it by the pound like blocks of wood just to have something to consume. Not even the Sun King, Louis XIV, was safe in the golden cage of Versailles. The Palace of Versailles was a marvel of architecture, but it was built for pomp, not for warmth. Its high ceilings and massive windows became a refrigerator. Historical accounts tell us that the king, the most powerful man in the world, sat at his dinner table shivering. The fireplaces were roaring, consuming entire tree trunks, yet the heat vanished the moment it left the hearth. It is said that at the king's table, the water in the crystal goblets froze solid between the moment the servant poured it and the moment it touched the king's lips. The ink in the scribes' wells turned to black ice, halting the bureaucracy of the state. If the king was shivering, the poor were dying. Roads became graveyards. Postmen and couriers were found frozen to their horses, stiff and upright, still holding the reins, preserved in the icy grip of death. Wolves, driven mad by hunger, left the frozen forests.
They entered villages in broad daylight, no longer afraid of man, dragging children from doorsteps. To survive, families burned everything they owned. First the firewood, then the furniture, then the very floorboards of their homes. They huddled together, sharing body heat, creating a nest of survival in the center of the room, listening to the wind howl like a banshee outside, a wind that carried the screams of the dying trees.
The Great Frost lasted for 3 agonizing months, but the cruelty of 1709 was that the thaw was almost as bad as the freeze. When the ice finally melted, it revealed a wasteland. The winter kill was absolute. The wheat seeds had frozen in the ground. The vines were dead black twigs. The orange groves of the Mediterranean were wiped out. What followed was not a spring, but a famine. France alone lost 600,000 people, not just to the cold, but to the starvation that followed. It was a disaster that reshaped the demographics of Europe, a Christmas season that turned into a year of mourning. It serves as a chilling reminder that for all our civilization, for all our castles and kings and fires, we exist at the mercy of the elements. The Great Frost was the time when the earth simply turned away from the sun, and the world held its breath. But this was not the only time the winter came with teeth. As we peel back the layers of history, we find other stories, tales of storms that buried armies and floods that swallowed cities on the holiest of nights.
8 years after the Great Frost, on a Christmas night in 1717, the danger did not come from the cold air, but from the dark water. This is the story of the Jule flood, the Christmas flood. Imagine the coast of the North Sea, the low-lying lands of the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. It is a landscape defined by its relationship with the ocean, a fragile truce held together by earthen dikes and wooden walls. On the evening of December 24th, the families of the coast were safe inside their homes. The candles were lit, the holiday meals were finished, and the children were tucked into bed, dreaming of the morning. But outside, a monster was waking up. A northwesterly gale had begun to blow, a deep, low howl that rattled the window panes. To the people of the coast, wind was a neighbor they knew well. They trusted their dikes, they trusted the walls that their ancestors had built. But this storm was different. It was a cyclonic tempest, a perfect storm aligning with the high tide. As the clock struck midnight, marking the arrival of Christmas Day, the wind shifted. It began to push the entirety of the North Sea against the land. The water rose up, dark, heavy, and silent, piling higher and higher against the earthen mounds. The sea was knocking at the door, and then it kicked it down.
It began with the sound of bells. Church bells began to ring frantically in the darkness, the alarm signal. But for many, the sound of the bells was drowned out by a terrifying roar, the sound of the ocean rushing over the land. The dikes failed in hundreds of places simultaneously. The water didn't just leak through, it exploded inward. A wall of freezing black salt water swept across the countryside, moving faster than a horse could gallop. In the farmhouses, people woke to the sound of crashing timber. The freezing water burst through doors and windows, extinguishing the hearth fires instantly, plunging the world into absolute darkness. There was no time to pack, no time to save the heirlooms or the gifts. There was only the desperate scramble upward. Fathers carried children up narrow wooden ladders to the attics. When the water reached the attics, they climbed onto the roofs. Imagine the scene. Thousands of tiny islands in a new dark sea, rooftops poking out of the churning water, pelted by freezing rain and hurricane winds. On these rooftops, families huddled in their nightclothes, watching their world disappear. They watched their barns collapse. They watched the church towers standing like tombstones in the surf, and they waited for a dawn that felt like it would never come.
The most haunting accounts of the Christmas flood come from the survivors who spoke of the strange peace. As the waters rose, the instinct for survival overrode the laws of nature. On the few patches of high ground that remained, ancient burial mounds and the tops of strong dikes, strange gatherings occurred. Witnesses reported seeing wolves and sheep standing side by side, shivering in the gale, neither attacking nor fleeing. Foxes huddled next to chickens. The terror of the rising water was so absolute that the predator lost its hunger and the prey lost its fear. They were just living things, united in the face of the drowning world. But the water was merciless. The storm raged for days. Entire villages were simply wiped off the map, their names erased from history. When the storm finally broke, the devastation was biblical. 14,000 people had perished in the night. The coastline of Europe had been physically redrawn. Where there had been fields and roads on Christmas Eve, there were now permanent bays and inlets. The sea had claimed the land as its own Christmas gift, and it refused to give it back.
The aftermath of the Christmas flood left a scar on the psyche of the survivors that lasted for generations. For years afterward, the soil was too salty to grow crops. The wells were brackish and undrinkable. The Christmas season, usually a time of abundance, became a time of mourning and hard labor, as the survivors tried to rebuild the walls that kept the ocean at bay. It became a dark folklore tale whispered to children. Be grateful for the dry ground beneath your feet. In the coastal churches of Germany and the Netherlands, you can still find marks on the stone walls, high up, far above the heads of the congregation, indicating where the waterline stood on that fateful night. They are silent reminders of the fragility of our existence. We build our walls, we light our fires, and we celebrate our holidays, assuming the earth will remain solid beneath us. But history shows us that the line between safety and disaster is as thin as an earthen dike in a winter storm. And sometimes the storm doesn't bring water. Sometimes it brings fire. We move now from the open ocean to the heart of the empire, to London. During the era known as the Little Ice Age, the winters in London were not merely cold, they were transformative. Today we see the River Thames as a dark, rushing current that never stops, but in centuries past the river was different. It was wider, slower, and held back by the medieval arches of the old London Bridge. When the temperature dropped low enough, the great river would stop. It began with slush ice, drifting in clumping grey masses. Then the silence would set in. The water would lock into place, forming a solid pavement of ice thick enough to bear the weight of a city. This was the birth of the frost fairs. It is a surreal image to conjure, a temporary city springing up in the middle of a frozen river. It was a carnival of the desperate and the daring. Tents were erected not on the muddy banks, but right in the centre of the channel. They called it Friesland. It was a place where the normal laws of London did not apply. Since the river was not technically land, the landlords and the sheriffs had no jurisdiction. It was a lawless zone of gambling, drinking, and chaos, lit by the flickering orange glow of bonfires burning directly on the ice.
Imagine walking down onto the ice from the frozen stairs of Blackfriars. The air is filled with a thick, choking fog, the famous London pea soupers mixed with the smoke of 100 coal fires burning on the river. The sights were bizarre.
You would see makeshift streets lined with booths selling gin, gingerbread, and toys. There were printing presses dragged out onto the ice, churning out souvenir tickets that read, "Printed on the River Thames." But the centerpiece of these fairs was the roasting of the ox. Huge fires were built, and entire oxen were spitted and roasted whole. The heat of the fires melted the top layer of the ice, creating slick, dangerous pools of slush around the feast, but the ice beneath held deep and true. The smell of roasting meat mixed with the smell of the frozen, sewage-filled river. It was a scene of medieval excess. Bear-baiting pits were dug into the ice. Violent football matches were played, where a slip meant cracking your skull on the frozen surface. Even an elephant, a massive African elephant, was once marched across the frozen river near Blackfriars Bridge, a surreal silhouette against the grey winter sky.
But beneath the laughter and the gin, there was a constant low-frequency terror. The ice was not concrete, it was alive. Those who attended the frost fairs spoke of the sounds. The river would groan. Deep, booming cracks would echo from the depths, sounding like cannon fire beneath your feet. It was the tide, fighting against the freeze, pushing up against the ice sheet from below. Every step you took was a gamble. You were dancing on the roof of a watery grave. There were moments of horror. During the fair of 1739, a sudden thaw weakened a section of the ice near a booth selling alcohol. The ice gave way without warning. The booth, the patrons, and the fires were swallowed instantly by the black water below. The ice then snapped shut again, like a trap door. People vanished. Pickpockets who were chased by the mob would run toward the thinner ice, risking death to escape capture. It was a place where life was cheap, and the boundary between the solid world and the drowning world was only a few inches thick.
The last great frost fair happened in 1814. It was a 4-day explosion of hedonism and fear, but it ended as quickly as it began. On the final night, the wind shifted. Rain began to fall. The singing of the ice turned into a roar. The vendors scrambled to dismantle their tents, dragging their printing presses and roasting spits toward the muddy banks in a panic. Huge cracks appeared, separating the carnival into floating islands. Those who were too slow were drifted out toward the sea, stranded on rafts of melting ice, crying out for rescue in the dark. And then it was over. The old London Bridge was demolished and replaced with a modern structure that allowed the river to flow faster. The Thames would never freeze solid again. The frost fairs are now just a ghost story of London, a memory of a time when the people claimed the river, building a kingdom of fire and vice on a foundation that could melt away with the morning sun. It reminds us that even our most solid traditions are often built on water. But sometimes the winter doesn't just freeze the world. Sometimes it brings a darkness that drives men to madness. Our next story takes us away from the crowds of London to a lonely cabin in the American wilderness. From the crowded ice of London, we travel now to the silent, suffocating white of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. The year is 1846. This is the story of the Donner Party, but not the version you usually hear. We are focusing on one specific day, Christmas Day. By late December, the 81 members of the wagon train had been trapped at Truckee Lake for nearly 2 months. The snow wasn't just falling, it was burying them alive. It stood 20 feet deep, hiding the cabins, turning the encampment into a series of dark, subterranean caves. To get from one cabin to another, they had to crawl through tunnels dug into the snowbanks.
Inside these buried cabins, the air was foul, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, smoke that couldn't escape, and the rotting stench of starvation. They had eaten the cattle, they had eaten the dogs, they were now boiling the hides that had served as their roofs, they were boiling the leather laces of their boots. But even in this living hell, the calendar kept turning, and as the sun rose on December 25th, the mothers of the Donner Party made a desperate, heartbreaking decision. They decided that Christmas would still come to the mountains. Margaret Reed, a mother of 4, had a secret. Weeks earlier, when the starvation had first set in, she had hidden away a tiny scrap of food, a handful of dried apples, a few beans, a small square of tripe. She had watched her children waste away, their ribs showing through their skin, their eyes sinking into their skulls, and yet she had not touched this secret stash. She guarded it like a diamond. On Christmas morning, inside the buried cabin, she revealed her treasure. There were no presents, there was no tree, there was only a pot of boiling water over a dying fire. But into that pot she placed the tripe, the beans, and the dried apples. She called it Christmas soup. The children sat around the pot, their eyes wide. To them, this was a feast fit for a king. They ate the watery broth slowly, savoring every calorie. For 1 hour, just 1 hour, the horror of their reality was suspended. They laughed. They told stories. The Feast of Tears was a testament to the indomitable human spirit, a mother's refusal to let the darkness take her children's humanity, even at the edge of death. But while the Reed family was sipping their soup, a few miles away, a different kind of Christmas was unfolding. 10 days earlier, a group of 15 men and women had strapped makeshift snowshoes to their feet and walked out into the white void. They were the Forlorn Hope, a desperate expedition trying to walk over the mountains to find help. By Christmas Day, they were lost. They had been caught in a blizzard that lasted for days. They had no food, no fire. Their feet were black with frostbite. They huddled together in a pit dug into the snow, screaming in the wind to keep each other awake, because sleep meant death. It was on this day, Christmas Day, that the barrier finally broke. The starvation had pushed them beyond the realm of human logic. As they sat in what they would later call the camp of death, looking at the bodies of those who had died in the night, the survivors realized there was only one source of food left. While the children back at the lake were eating their apple soup, the members of the Forlorn Hope began to carve the flesh of their fallen friends. It is a gruesome juxtaposition. The holiest day of the year, celebrated with a mother's sacrifice in the cabin and a primal bloody sacrifice in the snow pit. The camp of death marked the turning point. It was the moment civilization ended and survival began. When the Forlorn Hope group finally stumbled into a settlement weeks later, they were half-mad skeletons. They had survived on the bodies of 7 of their companions. Back at the lake, the Christmas soup kept the Reed children alive just long enough for rescue to arrive. Margaret Reed's family was one of the few where every single member survived. That Christmas of 1846 remains a scar on the history of the American West. It forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. What are we capable of when the lights go out, when the cold takes everything away? Does the spirit of the holiday survive, or does it freeze like everything else? Margaret Reed proved that love can survive the frost. The Forlorn Hope proved that the hunger can consume the soul. But the cold is not the only killer. Sometimes the threat isn't a lack of heat, but a lack of light. Our next chapter takes us to a year when the sun simply refused to shine, and the darkness brought monsters.
The cold of 1709 was a freak of nature, but the cold of 1816 was a curse from the earth itself. In April 1815, a mountain called Tambora exploded in Indonesia. It was the most violent volcanic eruption in recorded human history. It ejected so much ash, sulfur, and rock into the stratosphere that it wrapped the planet in a choking grey shroud. The ash cloud drifted over the oceans, silent and invisible, blocking out the sun. By the time it reached Europe and North America the following year, the weather had simply broken. They called it the year without a summer, or in the shivering farmhouses of New England, 1800 and froze to death. That June, instead of warm rain, snow fell in New York. Birds froze in their nests. In July, lakes in Pennsylvania had ice on them. The crops, corn, wheat, oats, didn't just die, they blackened in the fields, struck by a dry fog that smelled of sulfur. As winter approached, the dread was palpable. The harvest had failed, the barns were empty, and as Christmas drew near, the sky turned bruised, sickly color, a permanent twilight caused by the volcanic particles hanging in the upper atmosphere. The sunsets of 1816 were famous for their terrifying, violent reds and purples, resembling a bruised wound across the heavens.
Christmas 1816 was a holiday of ghosts. In Germany, in Switzerland, the famine was so severe that people began eating moss. They ground up straw in sawdust to bake into famine bread. The traditional Christmas feasts were replaced by a desperate rationing of resources. Beggars flooded the roads, but there was no charity to be found, for even the wealthy were watching their pantries dwindle. The volcanic winter had equalized everyone under the same grey sky. But the darkness of that year did something else. It warped the human imagination. Because the weather was so atrocious, people were forced to stay indoors for months on end. In a villa near Lake Geneva, a group of writers, including Lord Byron and Mary Shelley, huddled around a fire, trapped by the relentless, gloom-filled storms. Depressed by the weather and the end-of-the-world atmosphere, they decided to write ghost stories. It was from this volcanic darkness that Frankenstein was born. The concept of the monster, a creature made of dead parts, rejected by nature, was a direct reflection of the world they saw outside their window, a dead, frozen, unnatural landscape. In the Americas, the Christmas of Ash changed the course of history. The farmers of New England, broken by the frost that had killed their livestock on Christmas Eve, gave up. They looked at the frozen soil and decided they could no longer survive in the East. Following that dark Christmas, a mass migration began. Thousands of families packed their wagons and headed west toward the Ohio Territory and beyond, desperate for a land where the sun might shine. The volcanic winter effectively pushed the settlement of the American Midwest. But for those who stayed, the memory of that winter became a trauma. Diaries from the time describe a melancholy that settled over the population. Suicides spiked. The lack of sunlight caused a widespread vitamin deficiency, leading to rickets and depression. The preachers took to their pulpits on Christmas morning, not to speak of joy, but to speak of Judgment Day. They believed the sun was dying. They believed God had turned his face away from the world. The year without a summer serves as a dark monument to our fragility. A single mountain exploding on the other side of the world was enough to steal Christmas from millions of people. It reminds us that the holiday spirit is hard to maintain when the belly is empty and the fire is low. The monsters of 1816 weren't just the ones Mary Shelley wrote about. They were the spectres of starvation and despair that sat at the dinner table of every family in the Northern Hemisphere. Eventually, the ash settled. The sun returned, but the world had changed. The art became darker, the literature became more Gothic, and the map of America was redrawn. But while the farmers of 1816 fled the cold, our next story is about men who sailed directly into it, men who sought to conquer the ice, only to be swallowed by it. We leave the farms of New England and travel north to the most remote frozen graveyard on Earth, to the story of the HMS Terror. If you look at a map of the Arctic, you will see a maze of islands and ice. It is a place of stunning beauty and absolute hostility. It was here, in the winter of 1845, that Christmas became a funeral. This is the mystery of the Franklin expedition. Two ships, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror, the pride of the British Royal Navy, had sailed north to find the Northwest Passage. These were not ordinary ships. They were bomb vessels, reinforced with iron to crush through the ice. They were stocked with enough food to last 3 years. They had libraries, heating systems, and even a player piano. They were floating palaces of Victorian technology. But the Arctic did not care about their technology. By September 1846, the ice had closed in around them off the coast of King William Island. It didn't just freeze the surface, it locked the ships in a vice grip. The crews waited for the summer thaw, but the summer never came. The ice held fast. As the sun set for the final time in November, plunging them into the long night of the polar winter, the men of the Terror and Erebus realized they were trapped in the dark. Christmas 1846 was celebrated in the shadow of madness. The ships were tilted at awkward angles, pushed up by the pressure of the ice. Inside the wooden hulls, the air was damp and cold. Condensation dripped from the beams, freezing into stalactites in the sleeping quarters. To keep morale up, the officers ordered a Christmas feast. They opened the tins of preserved meat, the technological marvel of the expedition. They ate tinned beef, soup, and dumplings. They drank rum and sang God Save the Queen. But they didn't know that the food was killing them. The lead soldering on the cheap tins was leaching poison into the food. Slowly, day by day, the crew was suffering from lead poisoning. It made them weak. It made their gums turn black. But worst of all, it made them paranoid. Imagine sitting in the dark, thousands of miles from civilization, while your mind slowly begins to fracture. The men began to hear things in the wind. They saw shadows moving on the ice. The camaraderie of the Royal Navy began to dissolve into suspicion and fear. Outside the ships, the temperature dropped to -50 degrees. The wind screamed across the ice pack. But the real horror was the silence. In the Arctic winter, the silence is heavy. It presses down on you. Archaeologists and forensic scientists who later found the remains of the crew discovered a chilling timeline. After that second Christmas in the ice, the order of the ships broke down completely. The men abandoned the safety of the vessels. They loaded heavy lifeboats onto sledges and tried to drag them across the jagged ice toward the south. It was a suicide mission. What they left behind tells the story of their mental state. They didn't just pack food. They packed silverware. They packed curtain rods. They packed the player piano. In their lead-poisoned delirium, they clung to these symbols of civilization, dragging useless weight until they dropped dead in their tracks. One by one they fell, the marching dead. There is a final, gruesome chapter to the Franklin Christmas. When the food ran out and the men were dying in the snow, they turned on each other. Cut marks found on the bones of the crew members confirmed that cannibalism took place. The pride of the British Empire, the men who had sung carols and toasted the Queen, were reduced to the most primal state of existence. The local Inuit people, who watched from a distance, told stories for generations about the Agluka, the white men who walked until they died and who ate the flesh of their brothers. The wrecks of the Erebus and Terror were only found recently, sitting perfectly preserved on the ocean floor. They are time capsules of that frozen nightmare. When you look at the Christmas lights this year, remember the men of the Terror. Remember them sitting in the dark, eating their poisoned meal, waiting for a sunrise that they would never see. But not all frozen nightmares happen in the remote wilderness. Sometimes the horror happens right in the middle of a crowded town, in a house that everyone knows. Our next story takes us to the 1920s, to a family portrait that hides a terrible secret.
We leave the frozen wastes of the Arctic and travel to the rolling tobacco fields of Germantown, North Carolina. The year is 1929. This is a story that begins with a photograph. If you search the archives, you can find it. It shows the Lawson family, 7 children and 2 parents, posed stiffly in a studio. They are dressed in fine clothes. The girls are wearing new dresses. The boys are in suits. They look serious. They look perfect. But to the neighbors in Germantown, this photograph was a red flag. The Lawsons were not rich people. They were sharecroppers, living a hard-scrabble life working the land. For Charlie Lawson, the father, to suddenly take the entire family into town a few weeks before Christmas to buy expensive new wardrobes and pay for a professional portrait, it was unheard of. It was an extravagance that made no sense. Unless, of course, you knew it was a final memorial. Charlie was a man with a shadow over him. Years earlier, he had suffered a head injury while digging. A mattock had struck his skull. Those who knew him said he changed after that. He became quiet, intense. But in the days leading up to Christmas 1929, he wasn't angry. He was methodically preparing the stage for a tragedy. On Christmas morning, the ground was dusted with snow. The Lawson house was waking up. The smell of curing ham and baking cake filled the kitchen. 17-year-old Marie, the eldest daughter, had baked a raisin cake with white icing. It sat in the center of the table, ready for the feast. Charlie Lawson got his shotgun. He didn't yell, he didn't storm through the house. He went out to the tobacco barn first. He waited for his 2 daughters, Carrie and Mabel, who were heading out to visit their aunt and uncle. As they walked near the barn, he stepped out and shot them both. He then bludgeoned them to ensure they were gone. He dragged their bodies into the tobacco barn and arranged them, laying them out with rocks under their heads, like pillows. He then walked back to the house. One by one, he moved through the rooms. He found his wife, Fanny, on the porch. He shot her. He moved inside. The gunshots rang out, loud and terrifying, shattering the Christmas morning peace. The children tried to hide. He found them. The most chilling detail is the baby, Mary Lou. She was in her cradle. He didn't use the gun. He used the blunt end. When silence finally returned to the farmhouse, 7 people lay dead. Charlie then walked into the woods. The police and neighbors arrived to a scene of absolute horror. But what happened after the massacre is perhaps the most disturbing part of the story. Charlie was found hours later in the woods, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He had left no note, no explanation, just a pocket full of shotgun shells and a family wiped from the earth. But the house didn't stay empty. In a twist that highlights the morbid curiosity of the era, the Lawson farm became a tourist attraction. Just weeks after the massacre, Charlie's brother opened the home to the public. For a small fee, strangers could walk through the house of death.
They walked past the bloodstains on the floor. They looked into the cradle where the baby had died. And there, sitting on the sideboard under a glass dome to protect it, was the Christmas cake that Marie had baked. The raisins were still visible in the icing. Thousands of people came. They stared at the cake. They stared at the photo of the family in their new clothes, the clothes they were buried in. It was a carnival of grief, a dreamscape nightmare brought to life in rural America.
Why did he do it? That is the question that has haunted North Carolina for a century. Was it the brain injury? Had the blow to the head rewired his morality? Or was it something darker? Rumors persisted that Charlie had been involved in an illicit relationship with his eldest daughter, Marie, and that she might have been pregnant. The purchase of the new clothes, the portrait, the methodical execution, it suggests he was trying to cleanse the family of a sin he couldn't live with. The Lawson family massacre remains a dark stain on Christmas history. It reminds us that while we worry about the dangers outside, the cold, the ice, the wolves, sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is the person sitting at the head of the table. The portrait still exists. If you look closely at Marie's face in the photo, she looks sad, almost resigned, as if she knew that the new dress was not for a party, but for a funeral. But not all families are found. Sometimes on Christmas Eve, the house doesn't burn down. The people inside just vanish into thin air. Our next story takes us to a fire that defied the laws of physics and 5 children who stepped into the smoke and never came out. It was Christmas Eve, 1945. The war was over. The soldiers were coming home. In Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Sodder family was ready to celebrate. George and Jenny Sodder had 10 children. The house was full of noise, laughter, and the smell of pine. 9 of the children were home that night. At 12:30 a.m., the phone rang. Jenny woke up and went downstairs to answer it. A woman's voice was on the other end, a voice Jenny didn't recognize. The woman asked for someone whose name Jenny didn't know. In the background, Jenny heard the clinking of glasses and weird, maniacal laughter. She said, "You have the wrong number," and hung up. As she walked back to bed, she noticed something odd. The lights were on downstairs, the curtains were unlocked, and the front door was open. She locked up, assuming the kids had been careless, and went back to sleep. An hour later, she woke up again, this time to a sound, a heavy, rolling thump on the roof, like something or someone had landed on the shingles. Then a rolling noise. Then the smell of smoke. Jenny screamed. She shook George awake. They ran into the hallway to find the office on fire. The flames were moving unnaturally fast, eating the wood like paper.
Chaos erupted. George and Jenny grabbed the 4 youngest children, Sylvia, 2. Frantic, they ran outside into the snow. The 4 children were safe. But 5 children were still upstairs in the attic bedrooms: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. The staircase was already a wall of fire. George, desperate, ran to the side of the house. He planned to climb his ladder to the attic window and break them out. The ladder was gone. It was always kept in the same spot, but tonight it had vanished. He ran to his trucks, 2 coal trucks he used for his business. He would drive one up to the window and stand on the roof. He jumped in the first truck. It wouldn't start. He jumped in the second. It wouldn't start. Both trucks, which had worked perfectly the day before, were dead. He tried to scoop water from the rain barrel. It was frozen solid. The family stood in the snow, screaming the names of their children, watching the house collapse into the basement. In 45 minutes, it was over. The house was a pile of ash. The next morning, Christmas Day, the fire department finally arrived. They waited for the embers to cool, expecting the grim task of recovering the bodies. They sifted through the ash. They dug through the basement rubble. They found nothing. No bones, no teeth, no melted toys. The fire chief told George that the fire had been hot enough to cremate the bodies completely. But George Sodder worked with coal. He knew fire. He knew that even in a cremation oven, bones remain. A house fire burns at maybe 1,500 degrees. Cremation requires 2,500 degrees for 2 hours, and even then fragments are left. 5 children had simply ceased to exist. The mysteries began to pile up. The missing ladder was found days later, thrown down an embankment 75 feet away. The trucks, a mechanic found that their wires had been cut. And then came the sightings. A woman at a hotel claimed she saw the children a week after the fire, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women of Italian extraction. She said she tried to talk to them, but the men became hostile and forbade her from speaking to the children.
For the rest of their lives, George and Jenny Sodder believed their children were alive. They erected a billboard on Route 16 with pictures of the 5 missing children, offering a reward. It stood there for decades, a haunting Christmas memorial that stared at every driver passing through West Virginia. In 1968, 23 years later, Jenny received a letter in the mail. It had no return address. Inside was a photo of a man in his mid-20s. He had dark, curly hair and strong Italian features. On the back was written, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Illil Boys, A90132. Was it Louis? The eyes looked the same. The nose looked the same. They hired a private investigator to find the man in the photo. The investigator took their money and then disappeared. He was never heard from again. The Sodder parents died without ever knowing the truth. The house was never rebuilt. Today, the site is just a patch of grass. But the question remains, did 5 children burn into nothingness on Christmas Eve? Or were they stolen in the confusion of the smoke, taken away into a new life while their parents wept over an empty grave? Sometimes the earth swallows people whole, but sometimes the earth swallows entire civilizations. Our next story takes us back to the ancient world, to the bloody, chaotic festival that Christmas was built to replace. Before there was Christmas, there was Saturnalia. If you could travel back to Rome in December of the 1st century AD, you would not find a silent night. You would find a city turned upside down. Saturnalia was the festival of Saturn, the god of agriculture, liberation, and time. For 1 week in December, the rigid laws of the Roman Empire were suspended. The courts were closed, war was illegal, and the social order was inverted. It was a time of licensed chaos. Masters served their slaves at the dinner table. Slaves were allowed to wear the colorful clothes of free men, gamble with dice in the streets, and insult their owners without fear of punishment. It was a release valve for a society built on strict hierarchy, a few days where the world went mad so that it could remain sane for the rest of the year. The streets were filled with the shout of "Io Saturnalia! Yo Saturnalia!" People exchanged gifts, candles to symbolize the returning sun, and small clay figurines called sigillaria. But beneath the feasting and the gift-giving, there was a shadow. The sigillaria were not just dolls, they were substitutes. In the deepest, oldest roots of the festival, they represented the human sacrifices that had once been offered to Saturn to ensure the return of the spring. The most disturbing figure of this festival was the Saturnalicus princeps, the king of the Saturnalia. In every household and in the barracks of the soldiers, a man was chosen by lot to be the king of chaos.
Usually he was a lowly servant or a soldier of the lowest rank. For the duration of the festival, his word was law. He could command people to do anything: sing naked in the street, dance into a fountain, insult a dignitary. His commands had to be foolish, shameful, and chaotic. He was the lord of misrule. But for the king himself, the reign was short. In the older, darker versions of the tradition, specifically among the Roman legions stationed on the Danube, the game had a bloody end. The soldier chosen as king enjoyed a week of absolute luxury and power. He was fed the best food, given the best wine, and treated like a god. But when the festival ended, the king was sacrificed. He would take his own life on the altar of Saturn, cutting his throat to close the loop of chaos. His death was the payment for the week of freedom. The order of the world could only be restored by blood.
As Christianity began to rise in Rome, the church leaders faced a problem. They couldn't stop the people from celebrating Saturnalia. The Romans loved their midwinter party too much. They loved the lights, the greenery, and the feasting. So the church made a strategic decision. They didn't ban the festival, they hijacked it. They took the date, December 25th, which was also the festival of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and they rebranded it. They replaced Saturn with Christ. They replaced the King of Chaos with the Prince of Peace. But the old habits died hard. For centuries, the medieval version of Christmas looked a lot more like Saturnalia than the silent nativity we know today. It was a time of drinking, gambling, and mumming, where people dressed in animal masks and barged into the homes of the wealthy, demanding food and drink. This is why the Puritans, the men we discussed earlier, hated Christmas. They knew its secret. They knew that underneath the nativity scene, the old pagan heart of Saturn was still beating. They saw the Christmas spirit not as holy reverence, but the ghost of the Roman mob, drunk on wine and demanding chaos.
There is one final echo of Saturnalia that survives today. Do you have a king cake or a Christmas pudding with a coin hidden inside? That tradition comes directly from the Roman lots. The person who found the bean or the coin in the cake became the king of the Saturnalia. So when you slice your cake this year, or when you pull a cracker and put on that flimsy paper crown, remember what it used to mean. You are wearing the crown of sacrifice. You are the king of chaos for a day. It is a reminder that our holiday traditions are like layers of sediment. We build the new on top of the old, but the bones of the past are always there, just beneath the surface. And sometimes those bones are not human. Sometimes they belong to something much older, something that was here before the Romans, before the Christians, and before the ice. Our final chapter takes us to the deepest, strangest mystery of all, the story of what might be buried under the ice of Antarctica, a Christmas discovery that never made the headlines.
For our final story, we travel to the very bottom of the map, to the continent that shouldn't exist. Antarctica is the closest thing we have to an alien planet. It is a place of absolute hostility, where the wind can strip the flesh from your bones and the sun disappears for half the year. It is a white, blank spot on the map of human history. But in December 1946, just 1 year after the end of World War II, the United States Navy turned its attention to this frozen wasteland. They didn't send a few scientists in Parkers, they sent an armada. This was Operation High Jump. Led by the famous Admiral Richard E. Byrd, the task force consisted of 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft. It included an aircraft carrier, the USS Philippine Sea, and a submarine.
The official mission statement was vague, training personnel and extending sovereignty. But historians and theorists have asked the same question for decades. Why do you need an aircraft carrier to study penguins? Why do you send a battle fleet to the South Pole on Christmas Eve? The fleet arrived in the Ross Sea in late December. The men spent their Christmas of 1946 preparing for war against the ice. But rumours began to circulate below decks. Rumours that they were there to find something else. Something that the Nazis had been looking for a few years earlier.
The dark history of Antarctica is tied to the concept of the Neuschwabenland expedition. In 1938, Nazi Germany sent a ship to Antarctica, claiming a massive chunk of the continent. They dropped thousands of metal swastikas from planes to mark the territory. Intelligence reports from the time suggested the Germans weren't just land grabbing, they were looking for something. Underground caverns, geothermal springs, a place to build a fortress that could survive the end of the world. When Admiral Byrd's massive fleet arrived in 1946, the tension was high. The mission was scheduled to last for 6 to 8 months. They were building a base called Little America 4. But then, something went wrong. The operation, planned for half a year, was abruptly cancelled after only 6 weeks. The fleet turned around and limped home. They had lost a destroyer, several aircraft, and dozens of men. When Admiral Byrd returned, he gave a cryptic interview to a Chilean newspaper. He warned that the United States needed to prepare for a new kind of enemy. He spoke of flyers that are able to fly from one pole to another with incredible speed. What did he see in the white void?
This brings us to the most enduring and bizarre legend of the Antarctic Christmas, the legend of the Hollow Earth. A persistent myth fueled by a lost diary attributed to Byrd, though its authenticity is highly debated, claims that during a flight over the South Pole, Byrd didn't see ice, he saw green. The story goes that his plane flew into a massive depression in the Earth, a lack of ice where the temperature rose. Below him, he allegedly saw forests, rivers, and even extinct animals like mammoths roaming in a hidden geothermal pocket. While this sounds like pure fiction, it aligns with the Piri Reis map, a map from 1513 that depicts the coast of Antarctica without ice, hundreds of years before the continent was officially discovered. Did the high-jump fleet find a warm oasis in the ice, or did they find something more dangerous? Reports from the pilots spoke of balls of light harassing the fleet, phenomena we would today call UFOs. They described saucer-shaped craft emerging from the water, moving faster than any American jet, and slicing through the formation. Was Operation High Jump a scientific mission that failed due to weather, or was it a military retreat from a superior force guarding the bottom of the world? We may never know the truth of what happened in the Ross Sea during the Christmas of 1946. The files of Operation High Jump remain heavily redacted. But Antarctica remains the ultimate keeper of secrets. Beneath the miles of ice, there are lakes like Lake Vostok that have been sealed off from the rest of the world for 15 million years. There are mountain ranges, the Gamburtsev Mountains, the size of the Alps, completely buried, invisible to the naked eye. It is the perfect place to hide history. From the freezing of the sea in 1709, to the burning of the Sodder home, to the secret fleets at the South Pole, our journey through the dark Christmas reveals a different side of the holiday. It reminds us that while we sit by the fire, safe and warm, the world outside is vast, ancient, and often terrifying. The winter is not just a season, it is a force. It cleanses, it hides, and it kills.
So tonight, as you look out at the snow, or just into the dark, remember the stories of those who faced the cold and didn't blink. I am the historian. This has been the Dreamscape of History. Sleep well.